That's wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction. Trying to change things. And honestly, I'm also here with an ulterior motive. I'm looking for help, and I believe some of the answers to the questions that we are facing in the humanitarian space are very likely in this room. And given some of the presentations or discussions I've had this morning with some of you, I'm excited by the possibilities. So I'm going to jump in quickly, and as I'm presenting this, we'll keep in mind that we haven't solved most of these challenges right now, and I think some of these solutions, as I'm suggesting, may be found in computer science and in the computer vision work that perhaps some of you are doing. So why are we talking about digital humanitarians to begin with? Well, humanitarians are finding themselves in a very different climate. I often describe this as a climate change, but a data climate change. Humanitarians have, for a very long time, until recently, been used to an information landscape marked by information scarcity, a barren information landscape, so that when disasters used to strike, you wouldn't know who'd been affected, how badly, where, when, for weeks. And increasingly, we in the humanitarian space are finding ourselves in a world characterized by total information overload, right? A deluge of information, the so-called big data challenge. Now, this is a caricature. It's not like all of a sudden we woke up and we're in a big data world, right? It's not somebody flipped a switch. But it's a process, and it's a one-directional process in many respects, as far as humanitarians are perceiving this, which I think is fairly accurate. I don't think we're going to go back to no information anytime soon. And that's not to mean that we don't still have what I would call information deserts. Today, we do. There are plenty of places around the world that are not connected digitally, that are not online, that don't have cell phones and so on. And when disasters strike, those places that did have access, maybe they no longer have access because the cell phone towers go down, right? So information deserts certainly still exist. They will continue to exist for a long time still, but they're shrinking, unlike the real deserts in the Sahara. So by focusing my talk on this challenge, I'm not minimizing the persisting challenge of information deserts, but my interests lie in the big data space. And the challenge that humanitarian organizations have is often I describe as looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack. The vast majority of information that gets generated during disasters from social media, mainstream media, satellite imagery, aerial imagery is not useful, is not actionable, is not relevant. So those needles in our context in the humanitarian space are the pieces of informative, actionable intelligence, credible intelligence that can help augment what's called the situational awareness of disaster responders on the ground, allowing them to know who's been affected, how badly, where the damage is, not 3 weeks later, not 3 days later, but within hours, and then continued in real time. So this is the challenges that my team and I at QCRI have been looking at over the past few years. We collaborate and partner directly with established humanitarian organizations to better understand the information-based or the computational challenges that they face in this world that's characterized by information overload. So we apply advanced computing, human computing, machine computing to try and make sense of this information on their behalf so that they can do their work faster and better in more targeted ways. I want to give you some very concrete examples now from the most recent disaster that we have been deployed to at the request of the UN. I'm sure you saw this on the news over the past month or so, multiple earthquakes and aftershocks and so on. We were asked by the UN to look for, in this case, tweets that referred to urgent needs, for example. We were asked to look for pictures being posted on mainstream media and on social media that showed disaster damage, to then map all this information. The idea is that during the first 72 hours, usually humanitarian organizations ironically are not able to make sense of the data that's being generated. These unorthodox data sets that they're not used to, they don't even try and make sense of it. But they recognize that there's value in making sense of the social media, multimedia content, and so on. So that's why they turn to digital humanitarian groups like ours at QCRI. So the request we got for this, we responded to by deploying a free and open source experimental prototype that we've been developing in partnership with the United Nations over the past couple of years called MicroMappers.org. And what MicroMappers does is it seeks to combine human computing and machine computing to make sense of different types of information stacks, whether it's text-based like SMS, or pictures on Instagram, or videos on YouTube, or satellite or aerial imagery. We think that crowdsourcing alone is not the answer to the big data challenge. I think it's a sweet spot of combining both human and machine computing. So this is exactly what you would have seen if you were a digital humanitarian volunteer during the aftermath of the Haiti earthquake. We have access to thousands and thousands of digital volunteers from all around the world who come together to support humanitarian relief efforts through MicroMappers on behalf of the United Nations. In this case, we had about 3,000 volunteers in 87 countries around the world who mobilized and volunteered their time online to make sense of these information stacks that were getting generated. These information needs come from the UN. This is the gap. This is what they want to know about during the first 72 hours. So it's very simple. We're automatically pushing the tweets, volunteers are tagging the tweets, and then we've got a platform called Ater, AIDR, which is also free, open source, and it stands for Artificial Intelligence for Disaster Response, that simply does real-time machine learning based on the tweets that are being tagged, and then can automatically tag about 2 million tweets per hour when need be. And in this case, we had about 8,000 human-tagged or human-labeled tweets within a matter of a day or two, and then we're able to automatically classify about 500,000 tweets, literally just in the blink of an eye, as they were coming in, and finding those needles and sharing them with our humanitarian colleagues. Now, most people are not on Twitter, much to Twitter's chagrin. But many people, whether it's a smartphone, feature phone, or just old phone, smartphone, or regular phone, has access to SMS, right? We know this from decades now. And so we've been working with UNICEF in Zambia and modified the Ater platform to basically do streaming text messages as opposed to streaming tweets. And they've been getting some really great results with machine learning classifiers of 80% and higher. And they're already automatically classifying about 60,000 tweets, text messages that they're receiving in Zambia as part of a public health project. And they want to expand that because in Uganda, they're receiving hundreds of thousands of text messages per month. There's no way they can keep up with that. And so this is also for me, an exciting opportunity to not just focus on the so-called high-tech or the new media, but work with supposedly old technology. I mentioned pictures. We did the same thing here. The UN wanted to know about disaster damage and where the damage was during the first 72 hours. Humans increasingly have sensors, digital sensors, and so we were automatically scraping pictures from Twitter, automatically scraping pictures from the mainstream media across 65 languages of news articles, and pushing them to MicroMappers, inviting volunteers to rate the level of damage. Now, these pictures are not from Nepal. This is just for illustration purposes. But what we did, like we do with tweets, is we show every picture to 5 different volunteers. And if 5 different digital volunteers agree more or less that a picture is severe damage, like this one, if 4 out of 5 or 5 out of 5 say this is severe damage, then we take that picture and we map it. Now, this is all crowdsourcing based, and what we're doing now was a group, a startup out of Stanford University, is starting to train new classifiers to recognize certain features. Ideally, for us, to be able to automatically identify disaster damage in a picture, but sometimes we have to walk before we can run. So the first approach we're taking is simply recognize whether there's a building or there's actually infrastructure in a picture, to pre-process that imagery before we post it to MicroMappers for volunteers to tag, and videos as well, right? We can do that. I think this group is doing a lot of that here. Just to let you know that all this stuff ends up on a map, not because maps are pretty, but because that becomes actionable. Telling the United Nations that a bridge has been destroyed in Kathmandu is a complete waste of time. Where in Kathmandu? They can't act on it if there's not some, at least neighborhood level reference to location. I want to move now to the UAV stuff, which I know this group is doing some very pioneering work on. This is footage from Typhoon Haiyan, which is a Category 5 typhoon in the Philippines. At the end of 2013, I was seconded to the United Nations to support their relief efforts on the information management side. And I was really struck by the fact that I saw about half a dozen UAV projects operating. And this was really unprecedented. I mean, Haiti earthquake in 2010, there was one, and it was one of those $1 million UAVs. And here you had 6 different teams, at least that I know of, operating UAVs. And I had started myself since 2011, 2012, playing around with UAVs because I wanted to figure out, okay, was this something we could use for disaster response? I just didn't expect that we would be here already. And this was 2013. So things have evolved very quickly. Now, what struck me about this response was that most of the UAV teams did not know about each other. Most of them did not share imagery with local authorities, with local communities. And when I Googled code of conduct, UAVs, disaster response, there was nothing there. So in terms of a policy and guidelines, there was zero there. And so this is why, right after leaving the Philippines, I was like, okay, we need to set up a community of practice. And this is why I founded the Humanitarian UAV Network. I'm sure all of you know already the advantages of aerial imagery over satellite imagery. For example, getting oblique images is particularly important. So pictures at an angle is particularly important for disaster damage assessment. And I'll say a bit more about that. Just to let you know, this is not just a little network on the side, but we've already been endorsed by the United Nations, and the UN sits on our advisory board along with the European Commission, the World Bank, the American and New Zealand Red Cross. DJI, the Apple of consumer drones, is also on our advisory board, SenseFly 3D Robotics, a number of NGOs and research institutes as well. And so they've been very active in helping launch and guide this network. So it's not hypothetical. Humanitarian organizations are starting to explore the use of UAVs for a wide variety of use cases, and not only in sudden onset disaster response, but also disaster preparedness, disaster risk reduction, early recovery, development, and so on. So the network itself, we have over 1,400 members in over 70 countries around the world. About 300 of these members have joined our pilot roster. So we have a roster of about 300 UAV pilots from all around the world. And thanks to our official partnership with Airvid, we have access to another 600 or so professional, certified UAV pilots in 63 countries around the world. Last week, I co-organized and co-ran the first ever official formal training on humanitarian UAV missions. The UN participated, the World Food Programme, European Commission participated with 3 days intensive 12-hour-a-day training so that we can start creating more knowledge within the humanitarian space about the technology and the processes that go around using this technology. I'm going to get to the computer vision stuff in just a second. We also are working with a team in Nepal where we're going to set up a UAV innovation lab in Kathmandu. We just got the funding last week, and so we're excited to set this up. I may actually be in Nepal at the end of the month to start doing some initial training for some of the teams. This may potentially be of interest. We have a crowdsourced crisis map of aerial pictures and aerial videos of disaster sites from really all around the world. If you go to uaviators.org, you'll find, for example, 40, 50 videos, pictures of Kathmandu or Nepal post-earthquake that people have posted online and that we have either reposted or they've posted directly on our website. And so there's a lot more content there to play with if you're interested. This came out last week. Consumer drones, just over 4 million drones being sold this year, double from last year, and industry experts in the drone industry expect this to be doubling for a few more years at least. And this is important for us because that means that aerial imagery, aerial data is going to become a big data challenge as well, to make sense of all this raw content and identify the needles in the aerial imagery. So my team and I, QCRI, have been starting to think about what we're going to do about this as disasters continue to happen. And so we've been modifying the MicroMappers platform to start crowdsourcing the analysis of aerial imagery. And usually it's not a good idea to launch a new and untested platform in the middle of a disaster. And in this, it's not always possible. Sometimes it's not a luxury that we have. But in this case, we had the opportunity of collaborating with a group out of Namibia, a wildlife protection group, the Kuzikus Wildlife Reserve. And they had flown UAVs over a few weeks, captured tens of thousands of aerial images of their wildlife reserve. The purpose being identifying what kind of wildlife they have, how much, how many, sort of where are they on a particular day, to get a better sense of what they have. Then what happened is they were sitting on all these tens of thousands of aerial images, and these two rangers at night would be going through each of these images on their own. And I found out about this when they were about a week into it, and I said, stop everything you're doing. I have an idea, because the colleagues who are flying these are colleagues of mine, Drone Adventures. So this is what we did. We upgraded the platform, let's see if I have it, and took all the images, sliced the images, did micro images, pushed it to MicroMappers, and then crowdsourced the search for wildlife in Namibia. And we'd never done anything that was not disaster related before, so we weren't quite sure what the response was going to be from digital volunteers, but they loved it. I mean, you had high schoolers, you had retired professionals, and everything in between from dozens and dozens of countries all around the world go all through these images in 24 hours. They were done. And we showed every image to 5 different volunteers to start triangulating and doing some data quality control as well. So rhinos, for example, got great CNN coverage on this as well. Considered quite novel. And then what we've been doing is we've been working with EPFL in Lausanne with their computer vision students to take all the data, all the annotated data, and see if we can start creating some machine learning classifiers. So I'm proud to report that we just submitted an article for peer review that we can fairly accurately automatically identify gazelles in aerial images, which may not actually be helpful for disaster response, but it's a proof of concept. It's like, okay, we can take human computing, take the output of human computing, use that to train machine learning classifiers, and then apply it. And the team is just now again in Namibia, flying again, and then we're going to try and apply some of this that we've learned. What was really interesting as well, according to one of the rangers, I told you they had spent about a week going through the images, and when the crowd went through these images, the crowd found animals and images that the rangers had not seen. I mean, these are rangers who have been doing this for years, if not decades. They know what these animals look like, but you have like a high schooler in Singapore who has never necessarily seen these animals in the wild, maybe in the zoos, and was able to identify it in the pictures, even though the expert wasn't. So this is a win for wisdom of the crowds, or crowdsourcing, that experts are important, but having 100 eyeballs on one picture can also help you a lot in finding those needles. Now, bringing it to disaster response, after Typhoon Haiyan, several months after Typhoon Haiyan, there was another disaster in the making in the Philippines, namely the destroyed millions and millions and millions of coconut trees were destroyed, which is a major source of exports and livelihoods for Filipinos. And that was already a huge problem from a food security perspective. There was a second problem in the making. The dead trees that started to rot catalyzed an infestation of the rhinoceros beetle. And so you had an explosion in the population of rhinoceros beetles who attacked the living trees, the living coconut trees, and were destroying those. And so it was a huge disaster in the making, and so we partnered with the UN as well, and a local UAV team, a Filipino team called SkyEye. They flew over these plantations and so on. We got the aerial imagery, and we invited volunteers to trace both destroyed and still standing, or destroyed and healthy coconut trees. And then what we did is we partnered with Simon Fraser University and their graduate students to take all the resulting data. I mean, we shared the results with the UN within a few days, but then we took the data after that and started experimenting and doing some computer vision work and so on. And I should say, I have no background in computer science or computer vision. I come from the humanitarian space, so a lot of this is very exciting for me, but it doesn't mean that I understand it entirely. Bring it to just a couple months ago, Cyclone Pam was a Category 5 cyclone that hit Vanuatu. Vanuatu is just off the coast of Australia and New Zealand, and the devastation was absolutely really mind-blowing. I was invited, what happened was the World Bank activated the Humanitarian UAV Network to provide support, aerial support to disaster damage assessment on the ground. So we recruited 2 UAV teams from the Humanitarian UAV Network. They were then contracted by the World Bank, and I was invited during my annual leave to spearhead the coordination of these 2 UAV teams in Vanuatu. So that's what I did for my holidays in March. This is one of the teams from New Zealand who are setting up their UAVs. I think a lot of you now, probably this group is very well versed in UAVs. A hexacopter. We were using mostly six multi-rotors, 1 fixed wing. You know what they look like. This is us just calibrating the UAVs. They obviously are, as you know, flying robots that you can program and so on. So a lot of our time was spent doing this, is basically programming the flight path and then getting permission from the air traffic control and the Australian Defence Force. One of the things that we did, based on a paper I'd come across, was not just do nadir vertical imagery. because that can hide a lot of the damage. The request we got from the World Bank was to identify all the houses that were fully destroyed, partially destroyed, and largely intact. And if you're doing nadir imagery, you're really just doing an assessment of the roofs. And you're not actually looking at the structure. In fact, there have been a number of cases where you had a roof that looked intact, but what had happened was the walls had basically caved in, and the roof had just gone down like this. And if you're looking from a bird's eye view, you say, yeah, the house is perfectly fine, which is not true. And if you had the oblique imagery, you would see very well that this house is completely destroyed. So this is some of the UAV pictures that I took this is for some recon work that we were doing in the initial days. What we ended up doing then was same thing that you saw with the wildlife in Namibia, slice up the images, push them to MicroMappers, invite volunteers to trace houses based on the 3-point scale that I described. So fully destroyed, partially damaged, little to no damage. If you go to micromappers.org and you go under maps, this map should still be available. Basically, we showed every aerial image to 3 different volunteers. And so a total of 2,000 aerial images were traced or annotated in a matter of days. And that's actually times 3 because we showed it to 3, so 6,000 high-resolution images. If you go on the map, you'll see yourself what an image looked like that a volunteer saw here. This was still in the process of happening, so you had 2 volunteers who had already traced this one independently, saying this is largely intact, blue is largely intact, yellow partially damaged, and so on. And we're really talking about very high resolution aerial imagery at an oblique angle. So we were averaging between 4 to 6 centimeter resolution, which frankly was a little overkill on our end, so lesson learned. And if you go through more of the images, you'll see some of the results. What we're doing now with an intern from EPFL is taking all this traces, doing obviously some quality control, but using the traces to do some machine learning classifier work. As I've been told by my scientist colleagues at QCRI, this is not trivial, Patrick. So I don't know what's going to happen, but they're very excited. They're saying they call this extreme data in the wild. It's no longer a picture taken in the lab from a very fixed camera angle, and it's very clean and so on. It's messy, it's difficult. But the idea here is to see if we can extend the Ater platform and MicroMappers to eventually, I don't even know if it's possible, but do some kind of perhaps near real-time machine learning. As volunteers are tracing, you've got the AI engines or whatever learning to recognize what disaster damage looks like. But there's still a constraint with oblique imagery, namely, I don't know what this house looks like from the other side. It may be completely intact, or it may be very destroyed. At the end of the day, disaster damage is a complex 3D phenomenon. It's not a 2-dimension phenomenon. So I think one of the things we're going to be seeing in the coming years, hopefully not too many years, is we're going straight to 3D. I don't think there's a real much point of limiting ourselves to 2D. So this is one of the villages in Vanuatu that we surveyed with the hexacopters. And of course, as I'm sure a lot of you know, you can reconstruct 3D point clouds from 2D aerial images. So I think the future will certainly be doing this kind of work. And I was excited to learn this morning about the idea of taking a swarming model to potentially create 3D point clouds on the fly. We had to wait the whole day. And we went back and we processed the imagery, and that's why. I mean, if you can already do better here, then the UN should be able to do, hopefully, what you're pioneering here. What we want to do also then is to see if we can crowdsource the analysis of 3D models. So you can take 3D point clouds and you can turn them into 3D models using a platform like Sketchfab. And this is a square in downtown Kathmandu after the earthquake. Somebody took the aerial videos, converted into a 3D point cloud, converted into a 3D model, and then started annotating the features of disaster that show disaster damage and so on. And what we want to do is say, okay, great. Well, 3D models are going to become a big data challenge as well. Why don't we start crowdsourcing it, get human annotated data, and then you might have guessed it, can we teach an algorithm to recognize what damage looks like in 3D? Can we teach an algorithm to recognize missing tiles, missing windows or broken windows, cracks on the wall, and so on. And what's going to be really important, you can learn more about some of the thinking I'm doing. This is my blog, irevolutions.org, where I basically use to think out loud about all these questions that I don't have the answers to. What we want to do eventually is be able to create a one-dimensional index, a per building score, damage score, that is based on maybe the number of cracks, the size of the cracks, whether the roof is missing, whether the windows are missing, whether the walls are missing. So maybe a dozen different parameters that eventually, one I would hope in my wildest dreams, could be automatically detected eventually in order to compute a one score of damage per building. That's exactly what the World Bank and the UN need. And if we can do this in real time, on the fly, with a swarm of UAVs, then my mission here is finished. So I would love to do something like that. Just to give you, there's also all the operations side. So when Nepal happened, standard operating procedures for the Humanitarian UAV Network is to create an operational page to start sharing information about needs. We basically serve as an interface between humanitarians who need information and all the UAV groups who are increasingly deploying to disaster zones, and ensuring that the UAV groups don't do anything stupid, although we can't really control that. There have been a lot of stupid things happening in Nepal. But also ensure that they share the imagery with local communities, with local authorities, as well as with humanitarian organizations. I could give a 2-hour presentation just on the mess that was in Nepal. But just to give you a sense of the different UAV assets that were being used and still are being used. Right now, the big concern is that you have the monsoon seasons that are about to hit Nepal, and 3,000 mudslides have already been identified pre-monsoon, and so now there's a race against time to do some mudslide risk analysis and modeling to determine just how dangerous those mudslides are, because what you're starting to have, unfortunately, is you're having folks who've been displaced who are rebuilding right next to these mudslides, and potentially in even greater harm's way as a result. So there's some real serious things happening. Just to give you a sense of use cases and what the aerial needs were from UNICEF, the UN Children's Emergency Fund, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UNESCO, and others. Disaster damage assessment is pretty classical. It's just getting a sense of, at various resolutions, whether village resolution or the neighborhood resolution. Logistic support, when you have earthquakes and typhoons and so on, the roads get blocked with debris, or houses that collapse, or trees. Some of the teams that were liaising with the Humanitarian UAV Network were using UAVs to identify which roads to prioritize for clearance operations in order to try and do this more efficiently. Heritage sites, this is where UNESCO and the government partnered with one of the UAV teams I was liaising with to do very high resolution 3D models of temples and other archaeological or heritage sites for a number of different reasons. Unfortunately, body recovery after the mudslides. Search and rescue should have really come first. I'm not sure why it didn't. And now, like I said, landslide risks. I mentioned already there are a bunch of videos that you can find on the crisis map. This was one of the teams, Global, a bit of an unfortunate name that they call themselves, Global DIRT, but it stands for Disaster Immediate Response Team. And they were very, very active and sharing a lot of their imagery with us, including some 3D point clouds and so on. And I mentioned the monsoon. This is going to be an issue here. And then where are we going with this, just to wrap up, because I'm really interested in having an open conversation here, is, it's not about just aerial imagery. The trend here, at least in the humanitarian space, is towards data integration or data fusion. It's not about one layer of information. It's about the information stack, and using human computing and machine computing to solve, quote unquote, to solve the satellite imagery big data problem, the social media, multimedia, text messaging, aerial imagery, data mining, the news in 65 different languages, and so on. And of course, the Internet of Things. It's really taking all that and layering it to enrich contextual analysis, to be able to overlay social media reports on top of aerial imagery of a flooded area. So if you have flooded areas that you have an aerial imagery, and you overlay that with Instagram pictures, and you see 17 different Instagram pictures showing the flooding, you start adding context to the disaster. You start allowing yourself to do some triangulation. And what we want to do eventually is do the triangulation on the fly. Not that it has to be visual analysis, but it's automated analysis, and you know exactly based on what the risks are. Maybe have a heat map and 3D model and so on. So that's my story for now. A lot more on this and the role of advanced computing in disaster response and my new book that just came out. And love to have a chat. Thank you very much.